And with no further ado, welcome to this evening's interview with none other than Dr. Marc Bubbs. We're very lucky to have him today with us because he's a very, very busy man from what I'm hearing. He's always busy doing different podcasts, but today specifically we'll be talking about this bestseller book that he's written called Peak, the new science of athletic performance that is revolutionizing sports. So for those of you who are familiar with the Nutrition Collective, usually we plan a 25 minutes interview with our speaker followed by Q&A. Today's session is slightly different because I have a co-interviewer with me, and this is none other than Jason from the Holistic Therapist magazine. Jason is actually the owner of the magazine, and he has a keen interest in sports performance as well. And so we thought, why not interview Marc Bubbs together for this interesting session on understanding as practitioners how we can really, really use some of these protocols, some of these tips and guidances that Marc has laid out in the book. So we're very excited to have you here with us, Marc. Welcome, Jason. Welcome, Marc.
Hi there.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Excellent. So before we start, I just wanted to say a few words about the Nutrition Collective. So we organize not just interviews, we're organizing specific events around nutrition, on health, nutrition, master classes. And if you're not signed up, do sign up with us at www.nutritioncollective.co.uk. We do have a few master classes coming up. It's for some of you who know Tim Spector, our favorite in the industry. He will be talking about immune modulation, the gut, brain, and microbiome axis on the 17th. So please do join us for either that one. And we've got Nikki Greatrix as well as Dr. Tom O'Brien later in the fall. So with no further ado, I'll let us start this interview with Marc Bubbs. Marc, tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you actually start to write this book called Peak, which I actually have right here with me?
Hey, nice.
And it's a beautiful book because I see it in lots of different sections, but I'm going to allow you to just take the platform first and tell us, how did you actually embark on this journey of writing the book and your background?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that over the course of many years, wanting to get a chance to put pen to paper of how your philosophy for how you practice. And, for myself, going back, over 20 years now, doing my undergrad and wanting to get into nutrition as it related to health. And, was finishing up my undergrad and doing some shadowing with various doctors and practitioners. And unfortunately, in the general, in typical medicine, Western medicine, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on nutrition for chronic conditions. I mean, we had obviously registered dietitians, but a lot of these chronic conditions, nutrition wasn't at the forefront at that point. This is the late 90s, early 2000s. Even in sport, we didn't have sport dietitians or performance nutritionists working with teams selectively. And so, there was sort of this gap around how you could apply this, movements, exercise, nutrition, lifestyle factors, how those things impact. And so, like a lot of people at the time, if you don't know what you want to do, you take a gap year, which turned into multiple, and then eventually decided to go back and do a naturopathic medical degree in Canada. So that's a full-time, 4-year degree. And that philosophy of having a holistic approach is, combined with my background in sport, really started to make sense. And you could see that the industry was moving in that way. So we see even the research around sleep over the last 10, 15 years exploding. And of course, nutrition, recovery science, all these types of things. And so it's been really exciting now to see all of this coming into sport. And from a practitioner standpoint in clinical practice, just the applications that we have there as well. The things that we see at the elite level are often not what we hear about on social media or what's purported in a lot of how these athletes get to these levels, right? And so we have a lot of clients coming in, whether it's nutritional regimes or exercise regimes or struggling with weight loss and various things that aren't really following an evidence-based approach. And so again, the book's just a chance to connect readers and practitioners with a lot of the the true experts on the first line who are doing this research, and also to reinforce some of those key messages, like consistency, which is a huge theme across this, regardless if it's nutrition or exercise. Just simply showing up and being consistent with whatever approach you choose actually is a great predictor of success.
It goes back to what we were saying earlier. It's I think a lot of people nowadays, there's so many different fads, there's so many different systems that are out there, and it's almost people are expecting this one rule for everybody in a sense, but a quick fix, and rather than having a change of lifestyle or something, like you said quite rightly, consistency, they're expecting something that's just done over a few weeks is going to get them this short-term goal, and then go back to the normal lifestyle. When actually, like you quite said, it is about consistency, it's about change of life, and I think it's about education, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah, and it's sort of this double-edged sword where, just to get started when you're busy and work's busy and home life's busy, if somebody comes to you and says, look, we're going to take 52 weeks or 2 years to get to where you want to go, I mean, most people are going to, even if it's the best approach, it's not as enticing. And so you can appreciate why people then gravitate towards sort of quicker fixes. And regardless if it's a fad diet or anything else, if it motivates the client to kind of move in the right direction, right? This sort of analogies you hear from a lot of sports psychologists, you're either moving towards the mountain or away from it, right? So where are you, slowly progressing towards? And I think that's our opportunity to then start to layer in some of the changes and habits that we need to help to convince people. Because, if we talk about things like weight loss, which, in terms of chronic conditions, if we just achieve weight loss, whether it's cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, a lot of these conditions are going to dramatically improve. The expectations from our clients are to lose a pound a day or 30 pounds in a month, about just under 14 kilos for those who are, I'm not too sure in stone, maybe that's a couple of stone. Whereas in the research, if you're losing 1% of your body weight a week, you're doing fantastically well. An average would be 0.5%, which for most people, when they look at that, the most common thing I get back from clients is, geez, I'm losing weight really slowly. You think, no, you're actually losing weight perfectly at the right rate. And so this is ultimately that idea of expectation to reality is something that as practitioners, we need to continue to reinforce, because ultimately clients get into, it's natural if you think you're not succeeding, we get a lot of negative self-talk and negative feedback loops. And now all of a sudden we decide, well, I'm not going to continue with that habit, or this isn't for me. And you get clients who just kind of follow that, as you guys know, that shotgun approach of, well, now I'll try this diet, and now I'll try that diet. They never fully appreciate that, all the diets operate by the same rules. And so you can pick whatever one you like, but at some point you're going to have to come face to face with some of the challenges and then do a little bit of that, harder work or detective work to uncover, what those roadblocks are.
See, because that comes back to exactly what you said, there's consistency. And I think, like you quite rightly said, Mark, I think social media has always been both an amazing thing, but also a curse in a sense. Where we go on and we get the sort of, look what I did in 5 days, and I was this, and then I was this. And there's a lot of smoke and mirrors, I think, with a lot of information on social media.
Yeah, there was a great quote by Neil Tyson deGrasse, the great astrophysicist, saying, search engine is the greatest confirmation bias out there, right? You type something in and you're getting back mostly what you sort of want to hear. And so we do need to, even as practitioners, be actively searching out, the corollary of our thought, the null hypothesis of all the things that we're thinking, and whether it's, let's say, low carb or low fat diets or whatever the intervention might be, we've got to really be cognizant of looking in the evidence base and trying to see the other point of view, because nowadays we get down this lane of just one strategy, right?
Absolutely. Looking at the whole system, and that brings back to the holistic approach, isn't it, really? Not being one track minded, and
Absolutely.
looking at the whole system. Absolutely.
There was a very interesting point you made in the book, Mark, about motivation, that, we can be quite motivated when starting off with a specific protocol, but at some point motivation and inspiration dies down. And when you're looking at your own clients and setting a protocol for them, for example, what would you actually do in terms of, how would you make sure that consistency is taking place? Are you actually coaching them into this as well, or?
Well, I mean, there's a couple pieces there. I think one of them is that clients will tend to think, well, I'm not an elite athlete, or I'm not an Olympian, so what they do doesn't apply to me. And, try to communicate with them, contrary to what you see in the commercial, they're not waking up every morning at 5:30, jumping out of bed, excited to hit their training session. Like most of us, the alarm goes off and it's like, oh, do I have to? The difference is they just do it. And they actually don't often even think about it. It's not even a choice. It's automatic. And if you imagine when you sit in your car, the first thing you do is to put your seatbelt on. You're not motivated. You're not inspired. You're not even disciplined anymore to do it. It's literally a response to the environment. And so ultimately, that's what we're trying to get to with our clients. We're trying to make, we don't have time in our days and our busy lives to be thinking about nutrition every single meal and every decision that we're making. And so ultimately, the goal is to start to ingrain these habits. I often like to start at the top of the day with things like breakfast. And can we get to a situation where all of a sudden after the weeks or months, and typically it takes a couple of months to really start to develop a habit, that you don't need to think about it anymore, right? It's just what you do. And of course you have a few options maybe that you enjoy, but we need to get to that point where we start taking a lot of the thought out of things, because clients can follow a certain protocol, even athletes, for a certain amount of time, but everyone as humans, regardless if you're an Olympian or the rest of us trying to perform at work and at home, we're going to hit a saturation point of being able to track things on an app or be able to commit to XYZ recipes. If it doesn't start to get ingrained in what we do, then that ultimately we're going to lose that consistency piece.
It makes sense. One of the other things I do aside from the magazine, I do psychotherapy, hypnotherapy, so I understand
Nice.
the mind. It's a passion that I have. And we were looking into designing certain protocols, and but I understand this, the mindset of almost, you've got there's 4 stages that I kind of understand, and it's kind of unconscious incompetence. So you're not even aware that you're not doing something the way you need to be doing it. Then you've got sort of conscious incompetence, when you're kind of almost aware that you're not doing something the way it should be. And then you've got conscious competence, so you're actually doing something, but you're having to really think about it. But when you get to the stage of sort of 6 to 8 weeks on average, we looked into this as well, you get almost unconscious competence. So getting to a stage where they're actually, if you drum something into the mind long enough, like you said, the 2-month period, 6 to 8 weeks, it actually starts to affect you on a cellular level. So it becomes an automatic thing. Like you said, you get up, you don't think about it, you just do it and you move forward. And that comes back again to quite rightly what you said, consistency. And if people aren't reaching that point, it just becomes a continual struggle, doesn't it?
Yeah, and ultimately we don't realize that we're, on the flip side, we're actually creating a lot of, for lack of a better term, bad patterns, right? We're getting stressed mid-morning, and so we're reaching for something sugary to cope with that blood sugar low or that inability to focus. And now this provides an artificial boost, right? Now, the body has plenty of fuel reserves to get us from breakfast to lunch without any kind of a snack, but now we start to set that pattern. Or the classic one obviously is the end of the day, right? Long, busy day, work, everything else, whether it's kids or commitments at work or social things, you get home, and then now it's, on the couch, and whether it's a glass of wine or ice cream or some kind of dessert. And when we repeat this pattern enough, we do become like Pavlov's dog. We're literally just sitting on that couch in that room, and your brain is now expecting this certain. And so people, again, start to internalize this and start to say, well, why can't I change this? What's wrong with me? And of course, it's nothing wrong with them. It's a natural human response, right? They're actually doing what they've programmed. That the key now is how do we break that connection? How can we then say, if we continue to use this example of end of day, do we go to a different room and do some reading, or do we take a bath and go into, again, a different room to start to break that connection of the expectation that the brain and body have of some of those. Again, it's fine to snack now and again, but these are some of the things that when they become habitual, all of a sudden, over the course of a week and months, that's enough for us to start to derail, sleep, and then health and focus and all these types of things that start to, go downhill.
It's very easy for it to become a reward system, isn't it? Certainly I know from my training in the past, and I've done it too, we all do at some stage. You go and do your Zumba class, you go and do your body combat, you go and do your gym or your powerlifting thing or your sprint training, your assault course, and you think, you know what, I've worked hard today. I deserve that treat. I deserve that ice cream. I deserve that. And it's very easy to fall into that pattern, which isn't overly productive. But like you said, it's nice to have a treat every now and then, but it's not, it's distracting yourself to not get yourself in that position and not leaving food out. So you're naturally wanting to keep eating.
Yeah, and even if we go back to like the definition of a treat is something occasional. And so even when we talk about things like, we don't realize that now the treat isn't a treat. It's actually just part of our diet because we're eating it every single day. And so that's sort of a funny one. If we look at strict definitions of things, it's like we've taken this thing that was a treat and now it's actually just part of our program. And yeah, everyone struggles with this. And again, elite athletes are no different. You know, we have NBA players who, you know, at 1 a.m. are knocking back bags of Oreos because they haven't fueled appropriately through the day. And then the brain and body are looking for energy intake. And because it's around and because it's handy, you know, again, they're just like the rest of us. They will reach for it. And it's, you know, we get that dopamine response and serotonin hit. And so in and of itself, it's not a bad thing, but it's more what it reflects. Like, why are we always craving that way? What's going on from a fueling standpoint through the day? What's going on from a training standpoint? If you are training intensely, you know, are you planning that appropriately? Or maybe you're you know, we call the stress load from just work life as well, right? And now in sport, we see them taking that more into account where, you know, they can calculate workloads on the pitch or in the gym, but for the other 22 hours when somebody's walking around in the rest of their life, we don't really know the mental, emotional stress load on that athlete. And that has a huge impact on their performance, which is now being acknowledged, which is something that I'm sure practitioners listening in would resonate with, because we know that has a huge impact on, you know, our ability to sleep well or make good food decisions or et cetera through the day, right?
Well, it's the cortisol, isn't it? The stress hormone, which creates a lot of the problem as well, I found. Certainly, I think if you're in the world that I used to be in, which was heavy lifting, powerlifting, and that kind of thing, and certain sports and athletic when I was younger, you know, when you are stressed, that cortisol level really does start to affect your muscles' ability to recover and to grow, actually.
Yeah, and I mean, we need those stress hormones to trigger some of those adaptations. It's more when we look at, again, the best of the best, they're able to, it's like push that gas pedal to the floor, but then when they're finished training, they take their foot off the gas pedal and now they're able to rest very easily. Where unfortunately, most of us, and just our environment now with connectivity and people's phones being inundated with work, is that, you know, that never goes away. They're never allowed to go back into first gear or into neutral. They're constantly being hit with these emails. And we know that if you're, for example, in some type of middle management position, because you can't predict what's coming down onto you, then your cortisol levels are actually much, much higher than, you know, the upper executives and CEOs, because they're more in control of what's actually being done. And so this is, again, some of these environmental things that we can't really control. And so we have to watch how much we can only control what's, you know, control the controllables is what they say in sport, right? And so if we're worrying so much about those things, we got to find some strategies, because, you know, that's not in your control. So, you know, what can you do from a nutrition, a movement, a lifestyle, a stress management? What are some of the tools that you can use to increase your resiliency? Because ultimately, you know, for a lot of us, we can't change the level of stress at the workplace, but we can certainly improve our resiliency, our capacity to cope with that stress, right?
Fantastic.
Very, very true. You interestingly talked a lot right now about, you know, the point of view of the athlete themselves, but as practitioners, you did mention somewhere in your book that sometimes, you know, we tend to be a little bit too excited about supplementing and, you know, enforcing supplementation or other add-ons such as testing to help the client achieve the best results. But you did mention that sometimes we tend to have a very failed approach concerning that. What did you actually mean by that, Marc?
I mean, failed approach might not be the right term, but yeah, I think sometimes we get too excited with testing and potentially obtaining results. So a classic example would be thyroid function, right? So we have a lot of clients who come in, they struggle with weight loss, and we see thyroid numbers that are, you know, mildly elevated or mildly outside the normal ranges. And now, you know, this is a warning light or a red flag, if you will, for us to do deeper investigations. But we do need to be more conscious of how much money we're spending on tests. For example, with the thyroid condition, we know, you know, in sport, it's a marker of overtraining. And so for our general population clients, you know, if they're not sleeping, if they're been trying to lose weight, but they're cutting calories steeply and exercising a lot, all of those things will throw off those thyroid numbers. And so if we're just trying to fix those numbers via some type of supplementation regime without actually addressing the root causes of why that's out of balance, then that's going to be a little bit self-limiting. And we know from the research that, you know, the first measure that you get when you're measuring a TSH, so if your client comes out with a 7, 8, or 9, then that's the most predictive of actually having a frank hypothyroid condition. those individuals will actually get the most benefit from medication as well as from a weight loss perspective. And so the test can certainly be useful. We just have to watch that if we're spending hundreds and hundreds of pounds and dollars on tests, and we know that at the end of the day, we're going to have those individuals requiring spend money on their actual, food and to implement this, we need to make sure that we're taking that into consideration, because we, too often that money would be, in my experience, better spent on the plan, on the execution of how we deliver it, versus the test itself when it comes back isn't actually changing your course of action as much. If it's not going to change your course of action, then it's more what we call a nice to know rather than a need to know. That test should really be dictating which direction that you move your protocol.
But surely looking at other markers then, such as inflammation or blood sugar levels, as Jason mentioned before, or you're looking at those kind of markers aside from the thyroid, again, maybe as a nice to have, but also as a, quite important indicator, or even pH levels of alkalinity and acidity. I think you mentioned it somewhere as well.
Well, for sure. I mean, this was an example of thyroid, but you want to get a constellation of markers. I mean, blood markers like your A1C levels, lipid panels, these types of things. And with any chronic condition, it's a complex problem. And by definition, and we talk about this in the book, Sidney Decker's work, we're never going to know all the inputs to a complex problem. So we have to be really mindful that we don't over-assume things. And I think it's nice when we do have, obviously, lab tests and objective metrics, because we can start to put the pieces of the puzzle together. We can combine those with subjective, the symptoms that we're getting from the client. For absolutely, those are all very important. I think, I would just say that was more, there are some programs where people will spend literally thousands of dollars on testing. And I'm not sure when we look at the evidence base of the efficacy of those tests, that's necessarily worth the money in terms of what it's going to tell us.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. And is there anything else? Imagine if I was a practitioner who had an elite sports person come to me, when you talk about personalized approach or a personalized nutrition approach, what is that process that you're taking them through?
Well, I think the big thing here is that we don't need to, elite athletes are humans just like the rest of our clients. And so it's a good place to start off with, is that, as much as we have personalized nutrition, the fundamentals are common across all of us, and that's going to make up a good 3/4 of everything, right? So, establishing, protein intakes based on your client's body weight, having an understanding of the energy requirements, right? In terms of, low carb diets can be very effective for weight loss, but initially we tend to lose a lot of weight because at the moment, if you go low carb, then we knock off 4 or 5 of the top 6 foods that most people eat, which are grain-based desserts, things like cereals, pizza, unfortunately not very healthy foods, but we do dramatically reduce caloric intake. And so that's a nice way to lose weight in the short term, but ultimately people will plateau, and then we need to appreciate some of the ways in which we can start to manipulate that. So I think for practitioners, listening in, I think whether I'm seeing a general client or an elite athlete is just trying to have an understanding of what their day looks like. How are they fueling through a day? And so, and I'm sure practitioners listening in would appreciate this. A client will zoom through their day in 3 lines. I eat this for breakfast, this for lunch, and this for dinner. And you sort of have to hold them up and go back to breakfast and dig in a little bit further of exactly what's going in, and how many coffees are they consuming? What do they put in their coffee? And so really trying to get a good sense of what's going on, because there's typically a lot of very obvious things that will come out initially, whether somebody's very under fueling. Common, unfortunately, belief is that if we're going to lose weight, we got to eat less food. Now, we need to eat fewer calories for sure, but the food on the plate can certainly be pretty large. And that's one of the most common things I get from clients is, wait a minute, I'm trying to lose weight, how come I'm eating so much food? And food can obviously be very nutrient dense, but very low in calories. And unfortunately, clients who struggle with a lot of weight gain, if we're talking 20, 30 pounds or obesity, they tend to struggle with foods that are really calorically dense and very nutrient poor. And so, as we mentioned, having some lab tests to get a baseline, getting that subjective intake of symptoms and what the client's goals are is always the first place to go. And then, from there, what are we doing from a nutrition and exercise and lifestyle. Those are the three big buckets for me, again, regardless if it's general client or an athlete. And supplementation can certainly be a strategy, right? It's more just oftentimes it's a convenience factor as well. Like even when we talk about protein supplements or things like that, it's just that unfortunately a lot of us don't have time in the day to be preparing from scratch all of our meals, even though that would be, an ideal scenario, but oftentimes we don't work in ideals, right?
I completely agree with you. And, I'm always transparent. And although I own this holistic magazine, I don't have the best diet in the world sometimes. And I'm quite lazy with food on occasion. I'll own that.
Yeah, it's a reality, right?
But what I do is I listen to my body, and I was blessed once to be sent this wonderful thing called a Vitamix blender, which occasionally I take everything that's healthy in my fridge, I throw it in the blender, and I just drink a pint of it, and then I'm done, So, but I think, like you said, it's convenience. And for me, I think if I'm enjoying food and I've got the time to do it between being a single parent and everything else, I will take the time to prepare food, and I'll have that mind connection to food. But there's other times if I'm rushing to the gym and I'm trying to have post food, I will consume maybe raw egg or something that's convenient, quick, and that will fuel me. And I think, like you've said, it is looking at the holistic thing. It's looking at the whole picture of an individual, and it's not one shoe fits all, really. Someone's stress levels, doesn't it? The stress levels are going to affect how they absorb the food, how much they take on, also the weight that they gain or lose. So there are certain things, and also what they're doing in the day. If they're up and about, they're a single mum and they're on their feet all the time and they're picking the children up, and are they burning a lot more calories, and are we checking what that person's caloric burning is during the day, because that's a huge part in what they should be eating.
Yeah, and that's the big one that people don't appreciate, is that when we look at an energy balance equation, I mean, your resting metabolic rate, which is all the calories you burn just being alive, just pumping your heart and ventilating your lungs, that's actually accounting for 2/3 of all the calories that our clients are burning. Exercise is only accounting for about 10%. And so if we have a client who is dramatically dropping caloric intake, then that resting metabolic rate will shrink. If they're then trying to out exercise, that client who's eating next to nothing and exercising a lot to try to achieve that, that again will start to lower resting metabolic rate, and we start to really almost like circling the drain, right? We can't catch up to that reduction fast enough. And for the example that you gave, a lot of parents or whatnot, they just don't have time to eat in the day, and then it's staying up later to get things done. And now we're not sleeping as much. And we know that sleep, lack of sleep will do the same. And so, the solution there is we need to sleep more and we need to eat more. And the eat more always throws people off. Again, we come back to this, but we need to consume more actual food through the day. And again, more food doesn't mean more calories necessarily, because people who tend to not eat a lot through the day, at the end of the day, they probably consume more snack type food than they realize. When all that adrenaline starts to wear off and you get to the end of the day, then all of a sudden we're picking things around the kitchen and we're taking on board a lot of energy at a time when we're not really going to be using it, right? Because we're going to be going to bed. And so trying to flip that on its head, oftentimes, again, I come back to that breakfast work. How can we just get our client to eat breakfast in the morning? How can we make it simple? You mentioned things like a smoothie. We can put some protein in there. Things as simple as yogurt. I mean, great protein source, whether it's dairy based or, soy protein based. Those are really simple ways of just crack the lid, put some berries in there, and all of a sudden you're off and running. So what strategy can you find? Because not everyone's going to want to do the 3-egg omelet first thing in the morning around the time, unfortunately. But, and that's probably where we do get the benefits with athletes of, having performance chefs and all these things available to them, because left to their own devices, they would be often just as lazy and not be able to make things in the morning, but people are doing it for them. And so then it's easier to just show up and eat than it is to do it all yourself.
Yeah, this is why I love holidays.
Exactly. There you go.
But I notice the same, when in my own personal journey, in my body, I noticed I could eat the same things, but if I don't, I always had this thing where I had to have a certain calorie intake. If I didn't eat enough through the day and I had clients and I was working and practice and things like that, I would have a habit of trying to catch up my meals in the evening.
Mm-hmm.
I would end up sort of trying to cram in my 3 meals late. Mm-hmm. And I noticed that was absolutely, catastrophic for my body. I'd start gaining fat, I'd feel tired, I'd feel exhausted the next day. But whereas opposed to if I spent 2 weeks sort of eating early, having breakfast, kickstarting my system, doing things the right way, and actually spreading, I'd find that I would be more efficient, I would work better cognitively, I was more on form, and it's almost like my body needed that fuel, and I wasn't crashing, and and I actually became more toned, trimmer, and more energetic, because I was actually utilizing my body correctly when it needed it. So even if you're eating the same things, also, again, like you said, it depends on what time of day you're eating, doesn't it? When you have that food and that fuel.
Yeah, and I mean, fasting can be a good strategy, but sometimes you find that people's meal frequency starts to go down in the eating window that they have, and now we're not getting enough protein on board or enough fuel on board. And to Ramina's point previously, we can use things like A1Cs and fasting glucose levels to let us know a little bit about someone's diet, right? Because as I talk about in the book, in chapter 3, all about blood glucose, individuals who are actually at the upper normal range, above 5.6 millimole, they're actually at 40% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And so these are some of the things we need to start to pick out when we're looking at some of those labs and say, okay, let's go back and revisit the diet. Let's go back and revisit the exercise and the lifestyle, because oftentimes, and I'm sure we hear it all the time, the clients say, well, my diet's pretty good and my bloods are fine. I haven't been flagged by my doc. And that's obviously a good thing they haven't been flagged, but there's a higher expectation we have of saying, look, you're still on the border here. You're still not where you need to be. And that's an opportunity for us to just change things. And I think what clients don't realize most of the time is they don't actually have to change that much. We can do very small things and get a bigger benefit, where unfortunately too many of our clients, and this goes for, fitness or in general practice and allopathy, would be just the clients are used to doing a lot and not getting much result. And so that's one of the reasons why it always seems daunting to take things on. Whereas once we can get them trying something small and getting a bigger dividend from that, then now all of a sudden we've got that internal motivation versus having the external, doctor or practitioner having to wag the finger and say, have you done this and have you done that?
Absolutely. I know we're running out of time, so I would like to take in a few questions that have come on in the Q&A panel. So the first question we have here is from Gareth, and he's saying, with the evidence presented in the game changers and athletes such as Lewis Hamilton performing at the highest level in world sports, are we now entering an era where plant-based nutrition will become the standard sports nutrition advice?
Well, I mean, Game Changers is a nice film. I mean, in terms of the way it presents evidence, it's still lacking, let's say, in certain areas. So we know that, we want to achieve protein intake. And so you can certainly, with my clients, whether they're athletes or the general population, we want to teach them the principles. The strategy they choose, whether it's plant-based or animal-based or what most people do, omnivore, eating a bit of both, that's totally up to them. The consideration around various sports, now, if you need a lot of caloric intake, plant-based can be quite beneficial, because oftentimes, if we're eating lentils, we're bringing on board carbohydrates, which is more calories. If we're eating peanut butter, then we're bringing on board more fat, which is, again, more calories. And so that's not so much of a problem for many athletes, although if body composition becomes a concern, then this is where we need to start to think about, because now we're bringing on board a lot more energy compared to what we would do if we had just animal protein. There's also some aspects around some of the micronutrition. And so, in the book I talk about as well, when we look at things from a processed versus unprocessed, to me, this is the better question to ask, rather than, plant-based is certainly a tool. And I think we know that everyone should be eating more plants across the board. So rather than trying to create a false dichotomy of should you just eat animals or just eat plants, I think everyone should eat a lot of plants, because we want to get that fiber, antioxidants, nutrient status as well. But the more we can get towards more unprocessed food, which is, I think, where people get surprised around things like eggs or dairy, various meats being included in the group 1 of the NOVA classification, right? And so, I think the big thing here is trying to consume those processed foods, get a lot of the vegetables in, absolutely. If you want to be more plant-based, fantastic. But at the end of the day, we can use those metrics, whether it's performance in the gym, whether it's the lab test, the subjective, to help guide us as well. Because if we're too married to one approach, whether it's animal, plant, keto, whatever, and we're not succeeding, we need to be flexible, because we might be missing something in that strategy we're not being able to achieve, right?
And it's a very true thing and good answer, because also with sometimes with vegan diets, you have other nutrients that start to miss in our diet, from B12 to vitamin D, etc. But if we did have a client, and again, this is a second question from Gareth, if we actually had a vegan athlete, what kind of nutrient tips would you be giving them? Would it be to eat more seaweed, sprouted seeds? Just a couple of things he's mentioned here.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of athletes, the first thing we want to achieve is the energy intake, right? They have energy demands, and if you're not putting enough fuel in the gas tank and you need to drive a certain distance, then the micronutrition is far less important, because we don't even have enough fuel to get to the destination. So you've got to really consider the total energy to begin with. And then because protein availability is a little bit less in plant-based, we need to just ensure that we're getting enough throughout the day. And this is a great example of where supplements can be great, because we know we can then achieve a nice 30 or 40 gram dose once or twice a day and really be able to augment what we can get from foods. And if an athlete who's plant-based doesn't mind consuming some dairy or some eggs, that also frees things up a little bit more for a bit more variety, because it's always interesting how, in the general population, we're trying to keep clients full, and we're trying to typically try to, have fewer snacks in the day, eat square meals and be able to, whereas with athletes, we're trying to consume more meals in the day. We're trying to consume foods that actually create more appetite so we can get more fuel in. So it's often times, the opposite. And it seems counterintuitive, because you might fuel your athletes after games with, higher sugar-based foods to create that hyperpalatability that's going to make them take on board more things. And of course, with a general population, that we wouldn't want them, at their desk knocking back 3 or 4 Lucozades in the afternoon, because that's, they don't need to fuel for those types of demands when they're sat at a desk. So long-winded way to say energy intake is really at the top of it. And then from there, your grams per kilogram of protein, your grams per kilogram of carbohydrates, you want to know what the demands of the sport are, because they're going to be different for each, and then fuel appropriately based on what's in the evidence.
Absolutely. We have one last question we can take, because we are truly running out of time. But there's Krish is asking about mindset. What is your idea about mindset? How do you work with that in terms of working with clients? Because I think you also mentioned in the book, I think at some point.
Yeah, so the whole last section is all on mindset, and so we talk about the brain and how emotion connects. And our sports psychologist at Canada Basketball, Dr. Peter Jensen, renowned sports psychologist, talks about how we don't make decisions based on our cognition. We make decisions based on emotion, whether we realize it or not, right? And so this is where we need to be able to communicate effectively with our clients. We need to understand that their own emotions are driving a lot of their behaviors as well. And so simply telling someone to do this strategy, even though it is the correct strategy, and why can't they just do it, right? And then there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of mindset pieces that we then need to start to dig into. Why, for example, in the book, we talk about how a wandering mind, we typically wander, when the mind is wandering, it wanders about ourselves, right? So the work of Dr. Marcus Reichel at Washington University. And of course, it typically leads to negative thinking as well. And so now if we have a negative feedback loop going through, we're going to start to make poor decisions. We're going to start to beat ourselves up over the fact that we can't accomplish things. And I think one of the great examples is the language that we use when we talk about ourselves. So there's a big difference between I failed and I am a failure. And I think too often, and you hear this with people, how they describe themselves. Again, I come back to weight loss, you'll hear clients say, I am disgusting. Well, that's a totally different sentence to I feel disgusting. Because when you attach the I am, then that's a trait you're attaching to yourself. And that's when we really start to get into a lot of the negative loops. And that's what starts to sort of sabotage a client's ability. And unfortunately, they can't just, achieve or execute some of those points that you're after. So yeah, mindset is massive. The 6 inches between the ears, they say in sport, is the difference between winning and losing. And I say for the rest of us, it's the same thing, right? Because if we can start to change that mindset, then it's amazing how implementing the action points becomes a lot easier, right? Because when the mindset struggles, it's easy for us to make excuses and come up with reasons why this or that isn't working. And this is when we start to really get into some significant roadblocks.
I'm so pleased that you've said that. And I was to my ears from obviously my side profession, and you are absolutely spot on. Absolutely spot on. And it's very rare that I hear people implementing the mind aspect and bringing it into the practitioner side of things. And it is absolutely fundamental. I think people themselves a set of rules about themselves. And like you said, you know, it's, I wish I could, one day I should, I can't. And they become that. And, you know, it's getting that right state of mind. And what we think it needs to be motion, and that leads to the behavioral outcome. And if practitioners can somehow find the root cause of their passion and why they want to achieve that, and you can find that fire, that's what's going to enable them to go through. I'm so pleased with what you just said there, and you're exactly right. You know, and you know, that is something that people need to implement more of.
100%. I mean, for the rest of us, and practitioners included, right? I mean, absolutely, it's a key skill. We work on the skills, the physical skills, but the mental skills tend to take a back seat, and they are just fundamentally important for performance, regardless of what we're trying to achieve.
Absolutely.
It's fundamental. One last question. I didn't realize it was someone who asked it on the Facebook Live, but Julie's asking, what do you recommend for a sprinter who has heats, semis, and final spread across one day to take enough energy to perform? That sounds like a lot.
There's a lot of variables there. I mean, we have to know what event the athlete's participating in, if they're male or female, what they weigh, all these types of things. And so, you know, what I would say is that we know that during compressed schedules, so when there's events followed shortly thereafter by other events, then carbohydrate intake between those events becomes important. And so you want to be considering that, and also considering how quickly that can be digested. And again, this is where, you know, consuming, you know, big plate of broccoli might not be the best approach, because we need to get fuel on board quickly, and we need to be satiated for, we need to be refueled in terms of glycogen, and have the gut be, you know, quite clean and empty for when they go to compete again. So this is where fruit, dried fruit, these types of things, honeys can be good as a way to get that in, and depending on the length of time, some protein in there as well. But again, it depends on the athlete, depends on the duration of the event. And again, this is where targeted supplementation can be a game changer as well, because depending on the duration of that event, then there could be some significant gains made there as well.
That's a great answer. Thank you for that. I hope, Julie, that answered your question. Marc, thanks so much for today. It's been so insightful, not just as someone who would like to train a little bit more, but as a practitioner myself. And I think it was wonderful that Jason could join us, because truly, I think him being an athlete himself, he has more insight, not just a holistic practitioner, but an athlete himself, gives us a better insight on how to work with you on this. But I wanted to say to everyone that do please try to buy this amazing book of Dr. Mark Bubbs. I think it's available on Amazon, Mark, and on Chelsea Green Publishing as well, I think.
Yeah, and in various bookstores and Audible. And if people are interested more in diving into the performance nutrition side, we have an online course coming out around peak, and then also around other sports as well, coming in 2021.
That was going to be my last final question. It's going to be that, guys. It was going to be, look, I mean, I'm personally interested myself. I think it's fantastic what you're doing, and it's certainly resonated with me.
Awesome.
Yeah, the approach you've come from. But this is something that could be applied to any practitioner, really. I think this is not absolutely, it's fundamental for anyone. That's literally going to be my question was, you know, how does a practitioner take this to the next level? Of course, the first thing to do, guys, get Marc's book, but you know, how do they take that further? How do they learn this? How do they implement that into their practice, into their modality? And now you just quite rightly said you're doing this online thing. When is that happening? Yeah,
we have the online course launching this fall, and you know, of course, the book is heavily cited, so we've got over 500 references, and so there's a lot of extra reading if people do pick up the book and they want to go deeper into various topics. And the online course will be kind of a deeper exploration into some of the elements. And again, the whole notion of the book is to really hammer home the fundamentals they're going to be key to helping, whether they're, you know, elite athletes or our clients in our practice, of the things that are going to help them be, you know, healthy and be able to achieve their goals. Because in sport now, again, this new mantra of human first, which really means we need a healthy athlete to really be able to have performance. And it's the same in our practice. You know, we need to try to create that health in our patients for them to achieve their own performance goals at work, you know, at home, etc.
Absolutely. You're a breath of fresh air, Marc.
You really
I appreciate you guys having me on.
And the mindset thing was just mind-blowing for me. So thank you for that. Thank you to both of you. It's been amazing. We will be sending out the replay for the for today's session, so not to worry. But thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jason. It's been so insightful, and hope to work with you again very soon.
Thanks,
Fantastic. Appreciate the time, guys.